Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to the Synthmaster 3 tutorial course. So now that we're familiar with all of the oscillators, in today's video we're going to discuss the multi-sample editor. Now earlier on in the course when we talked about presets, we saw that we could load up multi-sample presets, and multi-sample presets are basically what the name suggests. We have multiple recorded samples that will play back depending on what keys we press on our keyboard. And we actually have a full multi-sample editor built right into Synthmaster. So let's find a multi-sample, load it up, and take a look at the editor. So if we right click here, let's go to a net preset to start fresh. And we can go on the waveform, let's select this guy, and we can go to multi-samples, and then we can pick all sorts of different ones. But for this example, let's do something like an electric guitar A string. So let's click on this guy, and now we have this loaded up. Now, as we did earlier on in the course, let's hover our mouse over this display here, and then we see the pencil icon. Let's go ahead and click this one. Now, since we're using a multi-sample, this is going to bring up the sample editor here. Now, up here in the top left, we can select different multi-samples if we'd like to. We can scroll through them with the left and the right arrows. We can save, undo, and redo as well. Now here in the center, we see these vertical blue bars, and these are going to represent the individual samples that are assigned to different keys. So if we play some notes here, so we can see that these light up as we play different notes, and we can hear that the sample changes. Now up here on the top, we have a button called MIDI select. Now if we select this, now the notes that we play are going to be shown up right over here. So it's basically selecting the notes via MIDI and displaying them right down here. And we can see the waveform change as well. So while MIDI select selects the ones that we play on our keyboard, we can also do some manual selection as well. So we can click on the ones individually if we'd like to do that. If we want to do a multi-select, we can hold down Control and then click the different ones that we'd like. Or we can click off over here and then drag for the ones like that. Or we can go to Select All, which will then select all of the notes in our group. Now, with all of these notes selected, we can adjust things on a global level here. So for example, let's say we want to adjust the velocity range. So here, if we have our mouse and we scroll up here to the top, it's going to change into a vertical arrow. And now we click and we can drag down, and same thing with the bottom. We can click down here and then drag up. So this is essentially the velocity range. So any incoming MIDI notes that are within this range here will trigger the note. So right here, we have 27 at the bottom and then 95 at the top. So if I hit some notes pretty quietly here, you can see up here at the top, we're at 26, so it's not triggering it yet. But if we hit something in the range, so like 92 there, which is in this range, it's going to trigger that note there. So now let's reset this back to default. We can go to select all and then extend velocity here. Now keep in mind, we can also grab these here and drag them to the right, something like that, which will basically pitch these notes to play on the different notes of our keyboard. So these notes right over here are essentially the same sample, but they are pitched up. Now, this can come in handy. For example, let's say we sample something out every other note or every third note or fourth note. We can still use those samples, bring them into Synthmaster, and then extend these keys so that they all fit the keyboard. So for example, if we hit extend key and reset this, we can actually delete quite a few of these. So let's hold Control again, and let's select a couple ones like this here, and maybe one more like that. We can go up here to the gear icon, and then we can go to delete regions. So now we have empty gaps here. Now, if we select all of these here and then we extend the key, then now we're going to have these notes filled in. They're not going to be the original samples, but they are going to be the ones that are still there that are now stretched to match these keys here. Like these two notes right here are going to be the exact same waveform, just pitched to match these keys. So something useful to keep in mind. So now below these vertical bars here, we have two sets of keyboards. Now the first one is going to show which sample this is going to be on. And the one down here, we can click and we can drag to go to different spots on our keyboard, which is really useful if we have a lot of different stuff on this group here. Now below that, we have a couple different things. We have things like low key, high key, the root key here in Sense as well, low velocity, high velocity. And for example, if we select this note down here and we want to stretch this a little bit, we can go down to the low key and just start dragging like that with our mouse wheel, or we can click and we can select here from the menu, and the same goes for the high key as well. And as we saw earlier with the velocity, we can go up here with the arrow, or we can kind of change it here with the mouse scroll wheel that way. It's another option to do that. Here on the left-hand side, we can see what the sample is over here. We have our traditional arrows we can cycle through, and we also have a very convenient play button here. So once we select this, we hear what the sample sounds like. Now, if we leave this on, we can click on the different vertical bars here and also listen to that sample. Now here where we see the sample, we have a couple different options here. We have an S, which is going to be the start of the sample. So every time I play the note, it's going to start here where the S is. If I bring this baby over here and play the note, this is where it's going to start. So we can kind of fine tune this where we want the sample to start once we play a key. Over here, we have an E for end, so where the sample is going to end. So maybe we can do something really tight like this here. And we also have fade in and fade out options as well. So here at the top, we can decide how long we want this to fade in for. We can do something really long like that. Back to normal. And we also have a fade out option. So if you have something kind of like this here, and we don't want that click at the end, we can always do a nice little fade out. And down here under playback, we have the direction. So by default, this is going to play the sample forwards. We can change this to reverse or to backwards if we'd like to. And then back to forwards. And below that, we have quality. Now, by default, this is set to normal. However, we can change this to low or we can change it to high depending on what we're doing. And on the right-hand side, under the pitch category, the first one we have here is key tracking. And by default, this is set to 100%. So let's say, for example, you have a sample that spans multiple keys and you don't want it to change any pitch or anything like that. You want it to just stay the same. Then make sure to set this key tracking down to 0, or you can choose any values in between if you're experimenting with something interesting. Now, below that, we also have transpose. So we can transpose individual notes if we'd like to. So if we want to transpose this guy, we can just scroll on our mouse wheel and transpose the note that way. Now, keep in mind with this transpose setting here, this can span multiple selections. So for example, if we grab this one here, let's hold down control and maybe do all 3 of these here, and then we can transpose, let's say up by 2. So now if we select this one, this is up by 2, this one is up by 2, and then this one is up by 2. So it works on a multi-selections as well. And also, for example, let's say we want to do everything. We can go to select all if we'd like to. We can also select the group at the top here, and then we can transpose, let's say up by 4. So now every one that we select here is going to be transposed up by 4, and then we can set it back to default, select our group, and then go back to 0 if we want to do that. Now here to the right, we have another sample window, and here we can do some fine tuning on the starting and ending. If you see how we move this end here, it's going to change these numbers here, as well as the start is going to change those numbers down there. But here we also have looping options. So let's say, for example, we want to play a note and we want a certain section of that note to loop. So all we have to do is let's go down to this mode here. And for example, let's change this to continuous. And then here on the right-hand side, we see some 2 carets here. So we can drag this, let's say over here like that, and then maybe make this one here towards the end like that. So now once we play a note, it's going to loop this section in here. And we can adjust these as well, and we can see that the start and end is also changing accordingly. Now we can also change the direction. So under the type, this is set to forward. We can also go to backwards. And if we want a ping pong effect, we can go down here to alternate. And then we can go back to forward. So we can always move these loop points with these carets here, but I want to show you some cool different tricks here to make this a little bit easier. So if we hold down shift, we can scroll into the waveform to have a higher resolution view of the waveform. Now, let's say we want to make a selection just with our mouse. We can left click here, maybe drag all the way over here like that. We can right click and then go to set selection as, and then go to loop points. So now the selection that we made is going to be the loop. And a couple of things as well. So let's say, for example, we want to do another selection over here. If we left click and drag, this is basically just selecting what we're selecting, right? However, if we hold down shift and then we drag, this is going to snap our selection to the next 0 crossing, making this loop a little bit smoother than if we just did left click, something like that. And also, if you want the waveform to look a little bit bigger, if this is kind of small, we just hover our mouse here in the center and then scroll on our waveform so we can see this a little bit better. So now let's scroll out here just a little bit and let's kind of talk about some of these different modes here. So right now we are on continuous. So first of all, let's close this X here and let's give us some release, something kind of like that. And let's go back into it. So essentially what we're doing here is we're looping this section. And when we let go, we can see that this is still going to be looping once we release the note. So during the release phase of the amp, this loop is still going to be triggered. If we put it even a little bit over here so we can hear this a little bit better, something like that, and let go, we can see that it's still doing that. So let's say, for example, we want the option to, once we release the note, we want this to come out of the loop and then continue on. For that, we can change this continuous mode to sustain, and then now the behavior is going to be different. And when we let go, it just finishes out that as well. And we can do that as well on the backwards and do it that way as well. So that's something to think about if you just kind of want to break out of the loop once you're done pressing the key and let it finish. Now, forever kind of doing this type of sample editing, a thing that's going to come up quite often is going to be, how are we going to crossfade or fade these samples so it doesn't sound so clicky? Now for that, let's maybe drag this out just a little bit, and here we can enable crossfade. So we have a lot of different versions here, and you're going to have to experiment with which one sounds the best to you. However, for now, let's go to linear. And here we see this X down over here, so for the crossfade. So here we can kind of place this so it sounds a little bit smoother, so we're fading these loop points. So this is going to be the sound of linear. As we play some notes, let's scroll through a couple of these here so we can kind of take a listen to how these different modes sound. Let's bring this out just a little bit more here. So yeah, depending on the sound that you have, a different type of crossfade might suit that a little bit better. So from a fresh preset, let's talk about the slice mode. Now this is used for slicing loops, and for that, let's load up a loop here. So let's click on the waveform and let's go under single samples. Let's expand the factory category and let's go under Nori. And for the first one we'll pick here is going to be this cajon loop here. Let's double click and load this guy up. And we can see our sample loaded in here. Let's go to the pencil icon. And again, let's go to MIDI select. So once we play a note, we'll see the waveform. So we have our loop here, and we can play it on different keys. So now let's say we want to slice this up and put this on different keys. So a different key will hit basically a different transient here. So for that, what we can do is down over here under the slice menu, we can go to the detection. Let's set this to user. And for the sensitivity, we can do something like highest. And now we're going to see all these different flags appear. Now we can move these however we'd like to. We can select and drag these to where we want them to be. Maybe set them a little bit closer or further away from the transients. And let's say, for example, we have a flag that we don't want here. We can always right click it and remove it, or we can go into the waveform and double click and bring that back here and then adjust it how we want to. So let's say this is something kind of how we like. Let's maybe bring this one just a little bit more forward like that. So now we want to split this up into different keys. So we have all our flags in place here, and we can select this gear icon, and down here at the bottom, we can separate slices as key regions. And as soon as we do that, now these are going to put these on these keys at these different flag points. So we can play it like that. Now on each different key, we have some more settings. So for example, let's select this guy here, this first one. And let's say we want the fade in to be not so abrupt here. We can click this and let's say, let's go to 5,000 or let's go 5,000 here, 5,000. And then now when we play the note, we basically have a fade in here and we go back to 0, and is also going to be instant. Now, this is just one group, as we can see by looking here on the left-hand side, that there's only one group here in the group list. And with this gear icon up here, we can create an empty group, we can duplicate one, and so on and so forth. And once we start working with key regions and groups, and we want options like deleting regions, cutting them, pasting them, moving them, and so on and so forth, those options are going to be found up here on the top right under this gear icon that we just saw a little bit ago. So if you're looking for something like that, you definitely want to check out this menu down over here, because it's probably where you're going to find that at. So from a fresh preset again, let's load up another multi-sample, as there's even a few more things we can do. So with our mouse, let's hover over our waveform. Let's select this here, go to multi-samples. And for this, let's check out maybe an acoustic guitar A string. Now, if we go to our pencil tool and we play some notes, we can hear our acoustic guitar. And let's also go on MIDI select and let's play this note. So now here on the bottom left, we have a section called trigger. And the first one we see is called note trigger. And by default, this is set to attack. So once we play a note, it's going to trigger that sample. Now we also have release, and for this to make sense, let's close this out real quick and let's add some amp release here. And let's go back to our pencil and play the same note. And under trigger, if we select release, what's now going to happen is that the sample will only trigger once we release the note. So we play the note, and then once we release, it's going to trigger. And you might be asking yourself, okay, what would this be useful for? So let's say, for example, you're maybe making a patch, maybe something like a piano or something where once you release the notes, you want a certain sample to trigger, maybe some type of transient or something like that. This would be useful for that. So maybe a first group can be some type of keys, and then once you let go, another group will trigger, and that will be on the release phase, which will be, like I said, some type of transient or some type of noise to kind of bring the authenticity out. So something to keep in mind there. Now, next up, we have something called this MIDI CC trigger. And a cool example of this is triggering two different sets of multi-sample groups based on the mod wheel. So let's say we have two groups. I want the first group to trigger when the mod wheel is going to be down, and I want the second group to trigger when the mod wheel is up. So let's go ahead and set that up real quick. So from a fresh preset here, let's set up two different groups. And for this example, I've sampled out a synthwave lead, and I've also sampled out a type of dirty square wave lead. So for this, let's hover our mouse over here. Let's go to the plus and let's create a new multi-sample. And we're going to navigate to where I've saved these samples. Now the first one is going to be this dirty square. So let's select the first one and let's go down here to the last one and multi-select those and go to open. So now I have all these samples loaded in here, and as you can see, there's some gaps here. Now this is where the extend key comes in handy because I didn't sample out every single note. So let's select all of these and let's go to extend key. So now every key is going to play this sample. We can even go to MIDI select as well. Okay, so now let's add another group here, and for this, we're going to bring in the synthwave lead. So let's go to our gear icon and go to create empty group. And for this here, let's bring in the ones down here, so the synthwave. And as we click and drag here, we can do a couple things. We can go to automatic, same key import, or chromatic. So for this, let's go to automatic import. And again, the same thing is here. I didn't sample out every single key, so there's going to be some gaps. So let's go ahead and select all of these, and then let's go to extend key. Now if we play some notes, we hear both samples. So for example, let's click this one here. We hear just our synth wave, and then here we hear the dirty square. Now these names probably aren't the greatest here, so let's go to default group and let's call this square. And then this one down here, let's double click and call this synth. So we have the name somewhat better here. Now, when we play them, they trigger at the same time. Now let's change that here. So for the square, let's go down to the trigger and let's go to the MIDI CC trigger and let's go to CC1 for our mod wheel. And for our values, let's leave it from 0. And then on the top end, let's go something like 63. And then for the second group, let's go again for the mod wheel because this is what we're going to be using to trigger it. And for the values here, let's go to 64 and all the way to 127. So this is how we're going to set this up here. So now, if we have our mod wheel down, we just hear the dirty square, and as soon as we bring this up here, it's going to trigger the synthwave lead. So if we look at this here in the pencil icon and do it on the controller, we have the synthwave, bring it down, the square, and then again the synthwave. So I've set the MIDI CC trigger back to the default values for both of these groups because now we need to talk about round robin. Now this is a mode where we can cycle between our samples that we have loaded. So if we want to alternate between the different notes in these different groups, here's where we can do that. Now we can select the first one here, and for the sequence number, let's go down to 2, and then for the type, let's go to round robin, and let's play some notes. And we can see how they cycle between the different groups. And if we added another group and we wanted to add that one in here to behave the same way, we can bring this up to 3 and so on and so forth. And we also have another option called random, because round robin is basically just cycling through these, so a predictive type of way. If we did something like random and we had multiple groups, it's going to just randomize and pick whichever one that we want. And this is a cool mode if we had basically lots of samples that are somewhat similar but not the exact same. We can set them up in a way so every note doesn't sound exactly the same, so there's a little bit more unpredictability, so keep that in mind. So next up, we have something called key switch. Now this one is really cool because basically it gives us an option to toggle different samples depending on which ones we want to play. So for example, here we have our square and we have our synth groups here. Now, by default, under key switch, these are all going to be C-1 here, or C-1. So if we play some notes, it plays both samples. So let's say we have a song and in the beginning, we just want to play this dirty square. And then maybe later on in the song, we want to press a button and then switch only to that synth lead. So we can do that with this. So for example, this square is C-1. Let's leave that as default. However, let's go to the synth here and let's select this and let's go to D-1. So now we just hear the square. So what happened to our synth? So now we need to tell Synthmaster or send a trigger to let it know that we want to play the synth lead. And for that, if we go to our piano roll here, if we press the C1, we have our square, and we press this D0. Now we only have the synthwave lead. Press the C again, send the trigger, dirty square, and so on, so forth. And this is really cool because we can press this on our keyboard if we want to, or we can build this into a session and just have a quick MIDI note triggering the different samples in the piano roll if we want to. So next up, we have BPM tempo, and we have a low value and we have a high value. So essentially, whatever our BPM is that lies within this range here, it's going to trigger that group. So for example, let's say we have our square here. Let's go for the low, 0 is fine. The high, let's do something like 99. And then for our synth group, let's go for the low, maybe something like 100. And then the high, we can leave that as 500. So right now, our tempo is 120. So it's in between this range here. So that means that the synth group here is going to trigger. Now for our square, anything 99 and below is going to trigger this here. So as you scroll down here, if we go to 99, it's going to trigger the square. And anything above that, so once we go back to 100, it triggers this group as well. Now this is useful if you have different types of samples that are different BPMs, so you can kind of program them in that way. Now below the trigger tab here, we have another one called Amplifier. Now this one has a few basic settings, but also very important settings. So if we played some notes, we can see that we're triggering the synth group. So let's go ahead and select that here and make sure our MIDI select is still on, so we can see that this note here is being triggered. Now, the cool part about this amplifier is that, let's say, for example, this note's a little bit too loud, so we can go to our gain and say maybe bring it down by -10. And now it's much quieter compared to the other notes, as this one is only -10 down here. We can also pan this, say like 50, for example. Now it's more on the right speaker, and we can click this again, go -50. Now it's more on the left speaker, so we can basically adjust this on a per note basis, same with velocity. However, the really cool part, if we bring these back down to 0, let's say we want everything to come down a little bit, or we want everything to be panned a certain area in the stereo field, we can go ahead and select the group, and we can now adjust settings here on a global group level. So let's say -15 and hit enter for this guy. Now all of these notes are going to have a value of -15. And again, we can go select the synth here and pan maybe -50 again. So now all of these notes here inside this group are going to be down by 15 dB and also panned 50 to the left. Now, if we want to set anything back to default, we can always select this group here and then reset those settings however we'd like to. And the cool part is we can do everything on a global level and then adjust one thing at a time. So we have synth here, we bring this down again, say -13, and then maybe this note here or this note here, we want to bring this down by an additional few. So let's go -15 for this one. That one's -15, and the other ones are still -13. So a very useful tab if you really want to kind of make some fine tuning and fine adjustments to the overall group. So as I'm sure you can see, using multi-samples inside Synthmaster offers quite a lot of customizability, which can make your patches come out really, really unique. So as always, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll see you in the next one.